In response to the widespread public outcry over police brutality, the U.S. Conference of Mayors has launched a new police reform and racial justice working group. The group will devise a set of guidelines to address police violence and patterns of racial discrimination. That does not include defunding or disbanding police departments. Chicago's Lori Lightfoot is one of the mayors spearheading this initiative. She's also the former head of the Chicago Police Board, which oversees police disciplinary cases. And Mayor Lightfoot joins me now. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So Tom Cochran, the executive director of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, says they hope to release actionable recommendations by July. Can you give us a preview of what's being proposed?
Well, what we're doing is we're going back and looking at previous work that's been done by the conference, President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing, and other data from reform efforts across the country. We're going to be surveying our membership because a lot of cities like Chicago have really been on the road to reform for multiple years. So part of it is just making sure that we really emphasize transparency. But you can be sure that we're going to be looking at accountability and disciplinary measures, looking at police contracts, officer wellness programs, and clearly how we focus on bridging the divide between communities and police, and looking at innovative programs to bring the community into training programs, and making sure that every officer, no matter where they police, really has cultural literacy about the surrounding neighborhood and the people, and not just getting their information from crime statistics. So we're looking at a lot of innovative programs. So I'm excited about this opportunity.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to ask you a little bit about this notion of cultural literacy, because this is something that we've heard both from you and others as well who have talked about. There needs to be some kind of greater understanding. When you talk about that, within this framework of law enforcement, what exactly does that mean? What does that look like?
Well, look, I'll take Chicago as an example. Unfortunately, we remain one of the most segregated cities in the country. We recruit from segregated neighborhoods. So many instances, people of different races and backgrounds are seeing each other as peers for the very first time in an academy. And when you then train those young recruits and then they get assigned typically on the midnight shift because of reverse seniority in neighborhoods that they're not familiar with, what they get taught is policing strategy and tactics and crime statistics, but they don't learn the rich cultural history of neighborhoods. And if you don't have that as your foundation, it makes it all the more difficult for you to build authentic relationships with the people that you are sworn to serve and protect. And what that looks like may be different from different cities and different towns, but what we want to do is establish a baseline to call the question on cultural literacy and talk about why that's so critically important. You can't form authentic relationships with people that you don't know, that you have no sense of their background or history, and you only view them through crime statistics.
I was born on the north side of Chicago. I know what you're talking about, how neighborhoods each have their very distinct characteristics, and cultural literacy is something that we've heard a lot of folks talk about. I want to ask you about another element. Earlier this week, you expressed support for police department licensing. This is something that we haven't heard a lot about, but tell us, in your view, how would that work? Well,
look, every state has a series of regulatory schemes for barbers, for manicurists. We know how to regulate industries. And what we're looking at is setting a baseline of criteria, training requirements on a regular basis, a threshold around discipline issues, so that an officer has to meet those criteria in order to be a peace officer anywhere in the state. This is not difficult. It's just been resisted by police unions. But not having a uniform set of standards, even within a state, so that you know that officers have a certain level of criteria and qualifications, we need to have that I think for the public to really have confidence that we're serious around reform and accountability. And the other thing is there's got to be a process for decertifying officers. I'll give you a perfect example from Chicago, since you're from here. John Burge, notorious John Burge, who was convicted and went to federal prison around torturing murder suspects for years as a commander of a group of detectives here in our city. He was convicted and served federal time, and yet after he got out of that, he could have gone someplace else and been the police. He died getting his police pension from the city of Chicago, even though he cost us hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements and judgment related to his misconduct and the people who work for him, not to mention we still are in a deficit of trust as a result of the criminal conduct of John Burge. And yet, no consequences befell him other than he lost his job as a Chicago police officer. That can't be a thing that happens. And we've got other officers over the years who've been convicted of corruption, federally served time, and yet they still have their pensions. That can't be a thing that continues. That's an affront to all of our values, and it's an affront to taxpayers who are footing the bill for these people who are convicted criminals arising out of their jobs as police officers. So there's, I think, a lot more that we need to bring to the table when we talk about this licensing issue, and we've got to break through the stranglehold that police unions have had on reform. And I'm committed to doing here in Chicago, and I think mayors across the country, particularly in this time, we have a moment where we can really change for the good the narrative around accountability and legitimacy and policing. And we've got to seize this moment and move forward aggressively and not be timid. We've got to be bold.
How do you get police unions and others invested, though, in the way that you are with this idea of reform? As you know, there has been a long history of resistance.
Look, it's not going to be easy, and I don't know that we are going to be able to get every union on board with this because they do resist reform. I know that, and I see that now. We're actively engaged in negotiations with our police union. But I think this outcry that we're seeing across the country, and particularly in major cities that have police departments that have a checkered history, this is our moment to get something done. This is our moment to make sure that state legislators and local officials really rise to the occasion, not just with rhetoric, but with actions. And I think if we've got that groundswell and we channel it to get done the kind of reforms that seemed impossible even 2 months ago, let's take advantage of this moment and move forward. Let's reform contracts. Let's make sure that we've got licensing of police officers. We talk about this as a noble profession, yet we treat it as something less than that. And if it's a noble profession, accountability has got to be part of the equation.
Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.